It's about 16 minutes of video, and then we'll stop. And there's a lot of things that I want to touch on that he didn't point out. So there's some things in your handout that we'll cover that isn't in the video. And of course, you're all welcome to add other things too. So let's go ahead and get started. And this is where Yeshua walks on water. We talked about one of the common themes throughout the Torah and the prophets and the apostles and the writings is the truth speaking out against powers, and specifically the ones that take advantage of the people by oppressing the weak, the powerless, the fatherless, the widows. And how many times do we find where people that are oppressed call out, and Yahweh steps up to rescue them? And if you remember, John the Baptist was in prison, and he was beheaded, and we kind of learned a little history behind why that happened. And so now we're at the point where Yeshua is with his disciples, and this is after the feeding of, remember how many he fed last week? You remember how many? What was the number? 5,000? Was it just 5,000? No, it was just 5,000 men, and plus women and children. So there were many more than 5,000 that the 12 baskets fed. Okay, so we ready?
Having abundance of blessings. Why does God give abundance of blessings? So that you can do the job that he's tasked you with doing, which is to share those blessings with the nations. That's what Israel was created for. That's what this has always been about, is about sharing God's blessing with all of humanity. And right here, we've got this picture of people who are learning to have abundance and to take that abundance and collect it together into 12 baskets so that it can be used for more good, can I propose to you? So the disciples just learn to walk in this way of multiplying these blessings. And of course, this reminds us of Elijah. Remember the Elijah and the oil with the widow who was the Shunammite, if I remember correctly. And pouring the oil and it multiplies. And then of course we had Elisha, or Elisha, if that's how you pronounce it, who fed 100 people with 20 loaves. And this is in 2 Kings 4, verse 42 through 44. You can check that out on your own time. So we see this connection of Moses, and we also see this connection to the prophets, because that's how Yeshua is being portrayed. He is the Messiah who is both king and prophet and priest, and he's the combination. He's what God had always intended humanity to be. He's the image of the invisible God, just like we are called to be the image of the invisible God. Yeshua is doing these things not just to show off his power, but to show us how to do it. And the very next episode, we finally see someone who gets it. Who gets it. They realize that the point of Yeshua's miracles is not to wow them. It's so that they can learn to walk in these miracles as well. So we go to verse 22 of Matthew chapter 14. It says, immediately he made the disciples get into a boat and go ahead of him to the other side of this lake. And while he sent the crowds away. After he sent the crowds away, he went up the mountain. So here's this connection again to the mountain, right? To pray. And it was evening. He was alone. And so the boat was already a long distance from land. It was being battered by waves. We got this storm brewing. And in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. The disciples saw him. They were like, oh no, it's a ghost. Which is a kind of interesting response, considering these are Jewish people. You can see there's still a lot of superstition in them. And I love it too, because you see the humanity of these people. You see that even though they've been with Yeshua, they've been walking in this way. I mean, we walk in faith having read the word. They were walking in faith with the living word. And look at how much they struggle with things. It's okay if we struggle with things. It's okay if we wrestle with things. The point of faith is not to just say, you know what, I'm just going to stick my head in the sand. It's to be scared. It's to be afraid. It's to question. It's to wrestle with these things. Because if we don't have fear, well, the reality I would say is we all have fear, but if we don't express that fear, if we try to bottle it up, because that's just not what a believer does, that's not what a good Messianic does, or what a good Christian does, or what a good Jew does. We just bottle it up inside, and we don't ask those difficult questions. We don't wrestle with the text. Things are going to boil up inside, and our shell is going to become like an egg. And the first thing that comes and threatens it is going to throw us completely out of whack. But if we acknowledge that we have fear, we acknowledge even that we have superstition, that it's a ghost. I mean, you got to realize this isn't just, Matthew's not recording just, history just because it was said. That's a very key point. And we see this, I believe Luke ends with this, and he basically says, look, there was so much stuff that we could have written about what Yeshua did. I mean, it would have filled volumes and volumes. What's going on here is this bringing down to the key things. And this this is embarrassing. I mean, can you imagine, you're like, yeah, I believe in this Yeshua, and I'm the leader, right? I'm one of the leaders in his community, and oh, by the way, one time I thought he was a ghost. Right? The fact that this is recorded is there to teach us it's okay to sometimes have these fears and doubts and even superstitions, because he's going to see through that, and he's going to show us. He says, take courage. It is I. Do not be afraid. God's going to work through the things that we struggle with. And so Peter, and this whole section, there's so much about Peter going on here. So we kind of see this real development of Peter going on here. Peter's excited. Peter's like, wow, he's walking on water. This is awesome. Hey, Lord, if it is you, command me, and I'm going to come walk to you on the water. Yeshua says, great. You get it finally. Come on out here. And he starts to walk on water. And of course, we know he sees the wind. He becomes frightened. He begins to sink. And he cries out, Lord, save me, which is beautiful, because that is the cry of the believer throughout Scripture. That's the cry of Israel in exile. That's the cry of the widow, the poor, the orphan, the oppressed. That's when God reaches out and saves us. And so we might think little of Peter and go, oh, he just didn't have enough faith, and he should have just kept his eyes on Yeshua. But this is Peter. Raw, uncut, unedited Peter. He's there, he's excited, he sees Yeshua, and he's like, I'm going to do that. He finally gets it. This is what this entire time has been about. This is what the Gospels are about. This is why we don't just have the birth followed by the death and the resurrection. All of this stuff in the middle comes to this point of what Peter is showing us. You're supposed to see it and supposed to emulate it. We see Yeshua having compassion on people. We're supposed to have compassion on people. You see Yeshua feeding the hungry. We're supposed to feed the hungry. Maybe that doesn't come through an inexplicable, multiplying of bread. But when you feed someone who didn't know where their next meal came from, do you think they really care if it appeared miraculously or if you bought it from a store for them? It's just as much a miracle. And so Peter here, he takes up this mantle that Yeshua has been trying to lay upon the disciples, and he steps out in faith and says, I'm going to do it. I'm going to follow in his footsteps. I'm going to walk on water. I'm going to imitate the Savior. But like us, so many times when we first take that first step in trying to live a life like Yeshua, in trying to have that faith of Messiah. See how I did that? You like that? when we first step out, it's not going to be easy. The first gust of wind we see, we're going to look away. We're going to say, oh, well, what about this? What about that? How do I do this? And we're going to start to sink. And what do we do at this point in time? When we start to sink, we cry out, Lord, save me. And he's going to, because you're walking in his ways. You're starting down that path, and he doesn't expect you to get it right the first time or the second time or the third time, or maybe even not the 133rd time. We see over and over again Yeshua's disciples, and Yeshua does seem to eventually kind of get a little frustrated with them, like, guys, come on. We'll see that in the next gospel cycle section, where there is this demon-possessed boy, I believe it was, or girl, I can't remember, and his disciples can't cast out the demon, and he's just kind of like, guys, come on. What have I been teaching you? I went up a mountain for 2 days, and you can't even cast out a demon, right? So there is this kind of back and forth, and there's a real relationship going on here. When it comes to God, sometimes we tend to get this idea that he is perfect and holy, and so the only way for us to approach him is in and through perfection. But it's a real relationship. Yeah, he wants perfection. Yeah, he's going to get frustrated when we don't get it right away, but he's always going to be there when we start to sink beneath the waves, ready to thrust out that hand and pull us back up above the waves and say, let's do this again. Start walking after me again. Keep trying to follow me. And of course, there's scolding. Yeshua, when he stretches out his hand, he says, you of little faith, why did you doubt? It's the same thing with our kids. When they fail over and over and over again, as children do, we always lovingly reach out our hand, we boost them up, and of course we say, why did you do this? But that's not meant to discourage them, rather to encourage them. Sometimes words are necessary. That, what do we call that? Positive, not positive reinforcement, what's the word? Constructive criticism, right? You of little faith, why did you doubt? This is constructive criticism. This isn't Yeshua getting upset. And as soon as they get back in the boat, I mean, the people, they see who it is, and they hit the deck. It says that they worshipped him. The Greek word there is our word for prostrate, proskineson, which means they prostrated themselves in front of him, and they said, certainly you are God's son, or the Son of God. Now, we've got to be realistic at this point. They aren't claiming that he is divine at this point in time. This is something that they don't recognize immediately. Right? And we see this throughout the Gospels, this growth of awareness of who he is. And you think about it, we've got the episode in Luke on the two people on the road to Emmaus. They're walking with Yeshua, and they don't even recognize him. And they finally realize this. We also see this in John's gospel. And remember, all of these gospels are written years after the fact. And so these statements, at the time they're being made, right, at the time in this boat, it really isn't likely that they're saying, oh, well, you are literally, God in the flesh at this point in time. However, by the time Matthew's gospel is getting written, they have realized this. And so we do have a kind of play on words going on here, right? When the term Son of God is a term that was applied to the kings. Caesar, at this point in time, was proclaimed throughout the empire, often on pain of death if you didn't do it, as being the Son of God. But by this time that Matthew's gospel is being written, they have recognized this. They have realized that he is, in fact, God in the flesh. And so I would propose to you that while in the original episode here, if we were to go into the minds of the disciples at this point in time, I don't believe that we could really honestly say that they were recognizing his divinity at this point in time, but being written later on, it's that kind of now we get it, now that we've seen this. And we see this kind of language, and I want to turn to the book of John really fast so we can see this, okay? John chapter 2, verse 19, Yeshua said to them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." And the Jews said, "It took 46 years to build this temple, and you will raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking of the temple of his body. So now look at, this is a very key line right here. So when he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scriptures and the word which Yeshua had spoken. Okay, so this becomes very key for us to understand my statement there, that originally this statement would not have come across them when they worshiped him and said, "Certainly you're the Son of God." They aren't thinking of him as God in the flesh at that moment, right? Prostrating themselves, they are saying, "Certainly you are the divine, you're the king sent by God to rule and reign over Israel." This is a statement of messiahship, of kingship. It's an extremely important statement. However, like we see in John, after the fact, after Yeshua is resurrected and everyone's like, have you ever been like to somewhere and then like after the fact you get together with friends and you're just talking about it, you're like, "Wow, did you see this, that?" And you're just going over, "Wow, how amazing this was." And you start to realize things that at the time you didn't realize. This is what's going on with the believers. At first they didn't get it. We see constantly throughout Yeshua's ministry them going, "You're not going to die, you're not going to die, you're not going to die," because they didn't get it. But after the fact, when they go back and they look at the big picture, they go, when he said this, it meant this. When we proclaimed him to be God's son,
Okay, 36:15, we meant. Okay. All right. So, some of the key points he mentioned here was, Yeshua did things to leave us examples to do likewise. And so, he fed, the multitudes when the disciples wanted to send them away because they didn't have food. And as he mentioned, it doesn't have to be, when we give to somebody that's hungry, it doesn't have to come in the way of where the food just appears miraculously. I mean, to the one receiving it, it could be an answer from prayer, and where somebody went out and produced it or bought it and took it to them. So those are miracles in the eyes of people that have a need and pray for it. So we need to recognize that. He mentioned that, Yahshua, when he came the first time, he was a prophet, he was a judge, he was perceived as a king, and a high priest, and but when he came, many, just didn't recognize him, as divine. I mean, he was in the flesh, but he was divine. And so it took him a while. In fact, he brought in John 2:22, where Yeshua told the disciples, "Destroy this temple, in 3 days I will raise it up." And it wasn't until after his resurrection and he appeared before the disciples that they remembered, the words that he said. And so then it clicked, that he wasn't just a man that God brought into this life and was blessed with with being able to do miracles. I mean, he already existed. He came down, and he dwelt among men, and because because he cares about his creation. So that's another point he made. And the other interesting one was, we have, the living word, the written word to help comfort us in times of fear, in times of trouble, to help us along the path, to give us hope. And yet we sometimes fear when we see, the storms of life going on out there. Where am I going to get money for this next bill? Or, somebody, comes down with an illness. And so, we have the written word for our comfort, for our hope. And yet, we struggle with fear. They had the living word right with them, walking with them. And yet they struggled with fear. And so it just shows us that, the humanity, the frailness of man, and but God is always there to reach His hand down and to help us out. All we have to do is cry out. All we have to do is, whatever the need, whatever fear we're going through, just cry out. Don't think. If you ask for a bread, He's not going to give you a stone. So He just wants us to humble ourselves and cry out, rely on Him, and He'll meet the need. It may not be in the fashion or the time frame we think, but He wants us to cry out to Him. Any comments or questions as we go through? Because I want to make sure if there's anything that came to you as we were going through, this chapter that, just spurred a thought or an idea or a testimony or something. Yes, Scott.
So in he made a statement about how it was that these guys they lacked in their faith. But the thing is like you just got on saying, they didn't have all the information we had at the time. So they didn't recognize it, right? And so it is easy for us who have information to point the finger and say, you have little faith? Wait a minute, they had little words. They didn't, they just had the Tanakh. And a lot of them didn't know how to decipher it, right?
Yeah.
So.
One would think all the miracles that He was doing in front of them, that, I probably would have been the same way, though, that, how could you not, trust? And, I'd feel like one of David's mighty men. I'm with the mightiest one of all, and yet they still had fears. Kevin. Uh-oh. He's calling.
When you said that, it also reminded me of one of the things I remember in my studies was you think the priests would have known it because when he performed on the lepers, they had to do 10 times more cleansing, and they had never done that before. It was the first time ever, if I understood it correctly. So that's another thing. They should have known that was, once they saw that happening, that the Messiah was present.
Yeah. Lisa has it coming.
They were let out of slavery. They watched the water split apart, and they get across. They're safe. And then when Moses goes up to Mount Sinai, then they get all the gold together to worship a cow. It's like, you just witnessed that, and you know what I mean. And you can't, and you are still worshiping a cow. You know what I mean? Like
So just a thought. Why do you think it's recorded? Those events are recorded. What's one of the purposes you think they're recorded?
to teach us, or
Pardon?
to teach us,
To teach us?
right?
What's one of the things that it teaches us? Pardon? What not to do? Yes. What a forgiving. All the answers were right. But I think He constantly wants to remind us how forgiving and merciful and long-suffering He is. You know, he's not out to, you ever see that game where these heads come up and you got this hammer and you hit it, you know? Your job is to, every time they stick their head up, to whack, you know? That's not the God we serve. Although when he keeps trying to get our attention, you know, he will play that game once in a while, but he's not going to leave you there, you know. So Stevie.
One of the things that I realize, we have a great blessing with the access we have to God's Word.
Yeah.
All right. And as we study God's Word, though, sometimes I'm guilty of this, do a shallow surface reading rather than praying and thinking through some of this. And so I've gone through that where I've judged others, and they were sinful, no question about it, but then so are we. Yeah. And so when, for example, who saw more miracles than those that were delivered from, in Exodus, from exile from Egypt? Yeah. I mean, manna in the wilderness for 40 years? I mean, amazing. And even crossing the Dead Sea on dry land, and amazing miracle. Nevertheless, Moses went up the mountain and was gone for nearly 6 weeks. You know, I stumble and fall much shorter time than that. Yeah. That was a long time. Yeah. To them. Waiting. No word, nothing. And they fell back into weakness that they brought with them into the wilderness.
Got a comment back here.
So the disciples, this example that we just read, they were trying to do something and didn't do it. They didn't hit the mark. So when they were trying to say, for instance, cast out those demons, or when Peter walked on water, that's an incredible amount of faith. And part of faith is not having fear. So it's human nature to be afraid of the unknown, like you said, bills, life, right? But it takes a whole much more amount of faith not to rely on getting the problem solved, but seeing even farther down the road. As soon as Peter realized he was walking on water, or as soon as these guys realized that they were casting out demons wrong, Yeshua was like, ye of little faith. You didn't have enough faith. Given this example, as soon as he said, holy smokes, I'm on water, or whatever went through his head, he pushed the faith out of his head with his human nature. And I think our human nature is just to be afraid, and then we dwell on it. And so then, as Stevie said, when they're walking through the wilderness, they keep going through all these trials, and instead of having the faith to see the end, they were caught up in the moment. Woe is me. Yeah. And so that's a big mental shift for humanity, is to choose faith and not fear.
I think of Joshua and Caleb in that story. There were two men that, they saw the goal, and that kept them going. And, that's what keeps me going, Okay. All right, so a couple points I want to bring out that he didn't cover in here. I want to talk about some thematic connections. Oh, yes, go ahead. Sorry. Yeah, if you got a comment, raise your hand.
Yeah, I was just thinking about this comment about being
Turn.
Okay, there we are. Fear is probably the most socially accepted sin in the church. In our fellowship, we don't even see fear as a sin. We excuse it. We think, what control do I have over what I'm afraid of?
Yeah.
But yet we see time and time again, God considers fear as a sin because it is a lack of faith. It's little faith, So we have no reason to fear. Perfect love casts out fear. So all this, but it really does show our humanity, and certainly our weakness and our great dependence upon God. So we see the encouragement that's there. Be strong and courageous. Be strong and courageous. And we have every reason to do that, but we still fear. We are still afraid.
Yeah.
And but God said, we can't excuse it. We need to be humble enough to recognize that, yes, we are afraid, but we need to trust God and be brave.
Yeah.
We need to do the right thing, no matter how hard it is or how scary it is, and not let our fear of man or anything else stand in the way of doing what we know to be right.
Yeah. It reminds me of the many battles in the Torah where they were getting ready to go to battle, and they went to choose their men. Anybody that had any fear, guess what? They didn't go to battle. Because to win the battle, you can't have fear. And and that just kind of reminds me of the fear-mongering that's been going on, since March of this year.
Absolutely.
They know that if they can get people in a mode of panic and fear, they can control them. And so in the thematic connection, I'm going to move on here. I brought on Matthew 8:23 through 27. This is we went through this already in a few sessions back, where Yeshua and his disciples are in a ship, and Yeshua is sleeping, and the storms are raging, and the disciples came, and they were afraid, and they woke Yeshua and said, "Hey, we're about to perish." And he says, "Why are you fearful, ye of little faith?" And he rose, rebuked the sea, winds in the sea, and there was a great calm. But the men marveled, saying, "What manner of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him?" So they didn't recognize his divinity yet, And but they said, "What manner of man that even the winds and the sea obey him?" And what does this story of sleeping in a storm remind you of? The story of Jonah. Remember, he was sleeping, and the men came to him and woke him up, and so I have it listed here. But I want to just mention one verse here. And so they came to him, and they woke him up, and he said, "I'm a Hebrew. I fear Yahweh, the God of heaven, which hath made sea and dry land." Now that term right there has a lot of meaning behind it. And what that meant to them, and what it meant to Jonah was, he's the creator of heavens and earth. They're going to obey him. Okay? And so they said, "Well, what do we do?" He says, "Throw me in the sea, and he'll calm the sea." They didn't want to do that. They tried some other things, but eventually threw him in the sea, and the winds and the storm, they ceased. And they fell down, and they realized at that point that this Yahweh was the creator of heaven and earth. Contrary to ancient Near Eastern thought on the mythology of the gods that resided in the deep for judgment. And I want to talk about that here in a minute. So the disciples' statement, "What manner of man is this that even the winds and sea obey him?" declares that he was not just a man, but he was Emmanuel. He was God with us. And then walking on water had an additional meaning or purpose. And you've heard me or maybe Marcel talk about this. Yeshua walked on water to dismantle a concept in the ancient Near East that the gods of this world resided in the deep, And so judgment by water was used to determine, often when there was a, there was a dispute, and, one person said this and the other person said the opposite, and so how do you settle the matter? So I had this thing called judgment by water, and maybe some of you have heard of this, but it was used to determine who was innocent and who was guilty. The accuser would bring the one that being accused forward, and they would bind the one that was accused, his hands and his feet, and I don't know if they put weights on him or what, but they'd be thrown into the water. If he survived, pardon? Go ahead. Yeah. So he survived. If he survived, that meant the gods that resided in the deep, their mythology gods, deemed the person innocent. Okay? If he didn't survive, then the gods deemed him guilty. Okay? So that was one of their ways of using their mythology, the gods that resided in the deep, to determine innocence or. Yeah. Yes. It was, it was a mythology, okay? It was, so some of them, I'm sure, probably lack of faith, might have believed that. But the Egyptians definitely believed that. And so I'm going to give some examples here. Let's see. The example of Moses being rescued out of the Nile. Okay. If you remember the story, I think it was Pharaoh's, was it his sister? Was it Pharaoh's sister? Miriam? Pardon? Who pulled Moses? Was Pharaoh's daughter? Daughter. Okay, I knew it was his sister, daughter. Thank you. Pulled Moses out of the water. Why didn't she destroy him? Because she knew that he was a Hebrew. Okay, it's because they had this mythology that said, the one I just explained to you, judgment by water. This boy survived, the water, so he must be a god. Okay, so she pulled him from the water and raised him as her own son. She had to. By their mythology, how they understood, how the gods operated in their mind, Moses was a god. And so the next example, then when Israel left Egypt, all the plagues, and many of them dealt with the River Nile. Why? God's systematically trying to dismantle their wrong theology on who controls the heaven and the earth. Every plague he used was some type of god that they worshipped and believed in. He systematically destroyed their theology on who the creator of heaven and earth was. Okay, so then they head to the Red Sea. Okay, a perfect. See, this is how merciful our God is. He wants to save the whole world, and he was hoping that through this systematic dismantling of their theology, that they would turn to him. He said that that he would bring Israel out with a mighty hand, that they all may know that I am Yahweh, the creator of heaven and earth. So he systematically used their own theology in the plagues. And then the parting of the Red Sea. That was the final judgment. So Israel went through the water, up on dry land. The Egyptians went through and were destroyed by water. So in the eyes of all Egypt, Israel was vindicated. The gods declared Israel as innocent, but the Egyptians were guilty. So you see how. So the walking, going back to the walking on water. Why was that in the Bible? Yeshua, was it just to prove how many miracles he could perform? No, it was more than that. It was to show that I am the one that controls, the heaven and the earth, the land and the water, the storms and the sea. I am the God, okay, that controls all that. So everything again, he's trying to systematically dismantle their wrong theology in hopes that they would turn to him. Seth?
I just wanted to add a couple other awesome examples of water judgment. The River Jordan in Kings, when Elisha same thing, in front of the king and the 150 representatives of the king or whatever. Then when Jonah and the whale, I mean,
Yes, I often wondered, why did Nineveh repent? This man just walks in their city and says, you're evil, you're wicked, repent or God's going to destroy you. Because this concept of judgment by water, the word traveled real fast that Jonah got thrown into the sea was calmed, and then this whale spits him up on the shore. He survives the water. They believed that he was a god because he survived the water. Okay, he was innocent. That's why they were moved to repent. Okay, and you know how far Nineveh is from Joppa? You know how far a journey that is? It's like 500 miles. So by the time he got to Nineveh, I'm sure he was pretty tired. Like many of us here working on those cabins, it's a journey, but we see the end. They repented, and because they heard the story, all right. And so, Stevie, you got a comment?
I did. Another judgment. This is Matthew 18, these verses here. At the moment that Talmudim came to Yeshua and asked, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" He called a child to him and stood him among them and said, "Yes, I tell you that unless you change and become like little children, you won't even enter the kingdom of heaven. So the greatest in the kingdom is whoever makes himself as humble as this child. Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me, and whoever ensnares one of these little ones who trusts me, it would be better for him to have a millstone hung around his neck and be drowned in the open sea."
Yeah, so there's another example using their mythology to show.
And he was using that
yeah.
with his disciples.
Yeah.
Because they were talking about who's greatest, and
Yeah.
he's saying
Yeah.
humility, because he wants them to be the children. That's us.
Yeah.
We are the children.
Yeah, try to escape a millstone tied
Yeah.
around that'd be pretty tough. So I have one more point I want to make. I'm kind of out of time. Touching the hem of his garment. So in the last few verses of Matthew 14, we saw where, let me go there. He went into the land of Gennesaret, and when the men of that place, I'm in verse 34 on page 2 of the handout. It says, "And when the men of that place had knowledge of him, they sent out unto all the country round about, and brought unto him all that were diseased, and besought him that they might only touch the hem of his garment, and as many as touched were made perfectly whole." Okay, so now jump to page 3. Touching the hem of his garment equals healing. Why were the people? Why did they think that they could just touch Yeshua's hem of his garment and be healed? Because they understood the Torah, the writings, and the prophets. This example also happened, and I'll get to that in a minute. In Matthew 9, verses 19 through 20, again, there was a woman, remember? She was diseased with an issue of blood for 12 years, came behind him and touched the hem of his garment. Okay. And for she said within herself, "If I may touch his garment, I shall be whole." He talked about faith. Okay, but where does faith come from? Hearing. They didn't have Bibles, so they had to go to the temple and hear. Okay, so where did she hear this? So we go to Malachi chapter 4, verses 1 through 6. "For behold, the day cometh that shall burn as an oven, and all the proud, yea, and all that do wickedly shall be stubble, and the day that cometh shall burn them up, saith Yahweh of hosts, that it shall leave them neither root nor branch. But unto you that fear my name shall the Son of Righteousness arise with healing in his wings, and ye shall go forth and grow up as calves of a stall. And then he talks about, remember ye the law of the Torah of Moses, which I commanded him in Horeb. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of Yahweh, and he shall turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers. So remember John the Baptist, he was coming, preaching the beginning of the end of the exile. And he warned them, who hath warned you to flee from the wrath to come? Repent, okay? And so in this text, it talks about, but unto you that fear my name, in verse 2, shall the Son of Righteousness arise with healing in his wings. So wings, what does that represent? Wings equals the edge or flap of a garment. It's kanaf, it's Strong's number 3671. It's an edge or an extremity specifically of a bird or an army, a wing, or of a garment, a flap or a quarter of a building or a pinnacle. So if you go to Numbers to get a little bit more detail on this edge extremity of a garment, a wing, in Numbers 15, 37, verse 41, it says, And Yahweh spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and bid them that they may make them fringes in the borders of their garments throughout their generations, and that they may put upon the fringe of their borders a ribbon of blue. And it shall be unto you for a fringe, that ye may look upon it and remember all the commandments of Yahweh. Now, we just read in Malachi, remember, that the Son of Righteousness shall appear, and there shall be healing in his wings. And he talks about to encourage people to remember the law, the Torah of Moses, okay? Those wings in honoring the Torah of Moses are connected, okay? And we see that here in Numbers, that you may remember all the commandments of Yahweh. Malachi mentioned that in the last book of the writings, okay? And I am your Yahweh your God, which brought you out of the land of Egypt. He's going to bring us out of bondage again, right? When he returns. And to be your God, and you will be my people. And then in Deuteronomy 22:12 it mentions, Thou shalt make fringes upon the four quarters of your vesture, okay? We just read where wings also means like a quarter. A quarter. A building has, like, it has four corners, but isn't this a temple? Isn't this a house? Okay. And so you see all the connections here. So the word fringes in the Hebrew is tzitzis. And it means a floral or a wing, like a projection, that is a forelock of hair, a tassel. Okay, so it's supposed to be a tassel, on the four corners, fringes of your or the border of your garment. So I believe the woman that had the faith, that she said, if I may just touch the hem of his garment, what was she reaching out to touch? The wings, the tzitzis of his garments, okay? Not that these have power within themselves, okay? All right? But the prophecy said that the Son of Righteousness shall appear with healing in his wings. Yeshua came, keeping all the commandments, okay? He said, don't even think that I come to destroy them. I come to fulfill and do them. And that's what these help us remind us to do, okay? And it's always a constant reminder. We need reminded, don't we? Constantly. And that's what these do. They help remind us that nothing more, nothing less. And it also is a witness, to our community and the nations. All right, so I just wanted to bring that in, and I'm out of time. Any last comments? All right, thank you for your time. Let's take a break. When you hear the shofar, we'll come back in and we'll start the next phase of service. Thank you.